Welcome to the Leader's Edge podcast. I'm Sandy Laycox, Editor-in-Chief of Leader's Edge. In this episode, I talk with three experts in governance and directors and officers insurance. Dan Siciliano is prior chairman and current vice chair of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. He's a Codex Fellow at Stanford and co-founder and CEO of Nickel. Deirdre Martin is Chief Underwriting Officer for Management Liability Financial Lines at Sampo International. And Joe Talmadge is Senior Vice President at Heffernan Insurance Brokers. We dive deep into the intersection of ESG and the D&O product line, discussing topics like where ESG disclosures will end up, how boards can prepare, where board diversity is going, and much more. Give it a listen. All right, Joe, Dan, Deirdre, thank you so much for joining me. I'm very excited to have you here. We're going to be discussing ESG, other topics within climate, the social diversity part of it. So very excited. Thank you all for joining me this morning. Our first question today is going to be around the litigation potential on ESG matters, as well as the backlash some companies are now receiving for ESG-related statements they've made. Dan, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. There's good news and bad news here. I think the good news is that there's nothing particularly new going on. What I mean by that is the dynamics that lead to litigation, the problems that give rise to ongoing litigation, those haven't changed. So that's good. It's not some sort of new out of the blue sort of issue. But the bad news is that the various ways in which litigation is going to arise is now more. And it's a simple formula, really. And one of them is that the more formalized disclosure that is required of a board, the more opportunity there is for some sort of problem in that disclosure. And that is one of the more important starting points for plaintiffs' actions around anything that is litigation with the public board. And so, climate disclosure has been radically or will be radically expanded. We don't quite know exactly how it'll land, but you're going to be talking about and sharing a lot more information. And that means there's a greater opportunity either for accidental or actual misrepresentation or other problems. So there will be litigation. I don't think we have to lose our minds about it. There's a lot of great best practices to avoid problems. And by the time you get to litigation, you've probably done a lot of other stuff wrong, which I think we'll talk more about. So we avoid getting to that stage. I will point out, just because there's another side to the story, kind of the anti-ESG political backlash, unfortunately doesn't mean that you get a break on the other side of the litigation. You're going to have to deal with both sides. So you have the kind of the backlash if you're subject to that, depending where you are and what industry, and you have the increased risk. So it is what it is. And I think directors are used to that. I think we just want to highlight how to avoid getting to that stage as best you can. And if you do get there, make sure you set yourself up well to be defensible as best you can.
Do we think, in addition to the environmental, because we see that a lot in the ESG realm, that's talked about a lot, is it the same for the S? Are we seeing companies seeing any backlash in that area, or is it mainly just environmental at this point?
This is Dan. I can give one short answer. I'll let maybe Joe jump in. I think you're going to see more in the other areas. My sense is that it has been more environmental to this point, but that I think is just the beginning.
One element here, right, when we spend time with our clients is to also emphasize the S, because when we think about the way securities litigation has evolved in recent years, it used to be really contingent on how financial statements were interpreted or misstated. And then there came this event-driven category of securities litigation where headline events, non-securities triggers, but things that really arose out of social issues, safety being primarily one of them. When you think about the impacted party, the party who suffered a loss was not a shareholder. The party who's suffering a loss that predicated this shareholder claim had stakes that can involve fatalities, that can involve injuries. So we've definitely seen where social has driven monetized loss that has been paid out under D&O policies for years. And then what we're also talking with clients about, while there's so much emphasis around the regulatory evolution of climate change disclosure, and Dan emphasizing those points as we're watching those so carefully, we think about environmental even broader, like we think about the exposure that has come out of either safety or true environmental fine and penalty exposure, some of that very material to companies, some of the exposure, again, causing injuries, fatalities, and again, being the underlying issue that prompts securities litigation.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And you see sort of those connections there. What do we think that where will the climate disclosure requirements potentially end up? And then how can boards be prepared to address them?
So I think this one's for me. This is Dan. So that's a really hard question. I think the honest answer is I don't think we have a good sense of where they're going to end up. I think they're going to be tuned back a little bit. There's been quite specific and focused commentary. A lot of the commentary points out that if you're trying to achieve better outcomes, this may not be the way to do it. It could backfire. So I think there's some material work that'll be done that might tune them up, pull them back a little bit. But that said, I think no matter what happens, how to make sure the board is prepared is the same answer. And that answer is to make sure that the things that we take as best practices for boards are applying in these relevant areas. So the flow of information, the reportable, accountable information that flows either through audit or through a special committee, setting up systems such that board members are in fact A, aware of the relevant data, B, understand, and this is the point of whether or not we'll see this rule part play out, understand the plan that the company has, both strategically and practically, to manage the direction of that data and what it means to do that and what the implications are, not just for climate, but for the overall performance of the company, both reputationally and practically, supply chain, et cetera. This is, I think, quite a heavy lift for boards if they haven't already been deeply immersed in this. It is its own set of metrics, kind of, side by side with, complex accounting metrics, and boards need to really start working to get up to speed, not to just receive them, but to consume them and embed them strategically and in addition to compliance, right? So it's one thing to get it and say, yeah, look, thanks for reporting. Yep, check, check, check. We approve, yay, we comply. That's great, but that's really not the bar. The bar is to take all of that and really wrap it into what it means strategically for the company and what it means for long-term performance. And that, frankly, that's hard. And I think that takes a little bit of a runway to get going. And so way before these rules land, boards should already be engaged in this effort, sometimes with consultants, to understand how best to pull that information in and really use it.
I know that actually when we talk about ESG, we hear people talking about this cottage industry of vendors that has popped up to do that very thing, right? To just help boards. Is any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think Dan touched on that too, in both of his replies to your questions, and really not knowing where the targeting will land, not knowing where the guidance will finally land, but being on this journey of making yourself defensible. So as a D&O underwriter, we can appreciate what the clients are relaying in terms of the work they're doing to purport to disclose what is material, but it is helpful to hear who they're working with as third parties, whether it be legal partners, consulting partners, software accounting partners, to kind of validate that the journey and the continuum of materiality assessment.
This is Joe. Just from a brokerage side, I think in hearing one of the criticisms from my clients is the lack of sort of clear metrics and standards in and around the ESG topic. So I would second Deirdre's commentary about the quality of advisors that they have as being a relevant sort of data point that our underwriters will look at when they're talking with our clients.
Oh,
and this is Dan, and of course, I'm very focused on like the board function per se. And so with that in mind, I think boards need to ask for help from this. Actually, thankfully, there's a cottage industry, and I think it's drawing on firms that have been in place for a long time and have had specialized subgroups. They're just kind of getting the attention maybe they deserved all along or growing. And boards need to engage with these organizations and ask management to do it for them to become better educated. And I'll give a very simple example. So if every board member does not understand the distinction between scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions and how that maps to how they might be held accountable, what are you? Are you a retail vendor that sells products into the marketplace? That's going to be a very different experience than if you are a data analytics company that is just B2B. And this difference between the scope of emissions, just understanding that is if you don't understand that well, then I would suggest that it's almost negligent to have any conversation. And so, and there's no reason you should have understood that necessarily, depending what industry you were in, but now you need to. And so boards getting up to speed by tapping appropriate director education is critical. And the good news is there's lots of it all over. Like some of it's free. You can bring in consultants, you can pay for it, but you should do something to make sure you're all up to speed.
Mm-hmm.
And Sandy, if you don't mind, I'd love to just tack on to Dan's point, because I think he raised a really critical element here. Like, again, when we're thinking about the concept of who we're insuring from a D&O policy perspective, it's first and foremost that board in conjunction with the C-suite. And while it is very nice to know the consulting parties that the board is working with, at the end of the day, when we think about defensibility, we want to really understand the rigor that the board is putting around board expertise and bringing in, if there's an exposure that's deemed, we're all using this term mission critical, but it came out of kind of some key decisions in derivative litigation. If there's an exposure that from an enterprise risk management perspective is going to be critical to how the company is able to conduct its operations, that the board is building its structure with the expertise embedded, not just relying on the consultant, but do they have an expert or a committee that's experts in specializing in that exposure?
That's a great point. Okay, we're going to move into a little bit back into that S space. Given, first of all, give us the basics on the California bills that were AB 826, AB 979, what the most recent rulings are on those, and then in light of those rulings, how boards should be thinking about diversity.
So, you can boil this down to something pretty straightforward, which is both bills, 826 and 979. Let's group them together as different types of diversity bills. So if you're headquartered in California, you're required to achieve certain types of diversity metrics on your board, either with women or people of color or a combination. And let's put that in a box. And let me observe first. These bills were the tail of a train that left the station a long time ago, which is, it is clearly the case that you get higher performing boards and ultimately better performing companies from higher performing boards if you have an appropriately diversified board. And that means different things to different people, and there's no one size fits all, but we know that diverse boards do better. Among other things, they're less likely to be stale, they're more likely to be in touch with their customer base, et cetera, et cetera. So the bills represented, an acknowledgement of that and kind of a desire to accelerate that with California-based companies. They have basically been invalidated, right? So two different superior courts, LA, across early May and then all the way through June, basically ruled them unconstitutional and invalid. The takeaway, I think, for boards, however, is that this was just a signal of what you should be doing anyway. Now, the follow-up question is going to be, are they going to come back? Will they retailer them? What will happen? It's very hard to predict, but what I can say with certainty is that the expectation in the governance community, in the institutional investor community, and ultimately, I think, in the broad consumer business markets, is that boards will be diverse. And so if your board doesn't meet the minimum standards of SB 826 or AB 979, I have a strong recommendation, which is you should be gunning for that anyway, as soon as you possibly can, because other forces and other attention will be paid if you don't. So ignore the California bills. Even if you're not in California, even if you don't think they'll ever come back, that is not the standard. The standard is diversify your board because you end up doing better. And we can get into that if you like, but there's a lot, it's now an old question that's been answered. There's a lot of great research that shows a diverse board does better. And it's not easy always to do. There's plenty of talent. That's not the hard part. But spending time to get people onboarded, sometimes it means you pull on people who weren't first directors already of a publicly traded company. There are some things you need to do it well, but those are all now done and practiced, and it can be achieved.
This is Joe. Dan, that's a great background on that. I'm really happy that you covered that because I get it as a pretty regular question, particularly for pre-IPO companies who maybe don't have necessarily as diverse of a board as we would like to see, and are looking at sort of diversifying that element of their company.
Okay, so let's talk about D&O a little bit more. And Deirdre mentioned a little bit of this, but is there more we can say, Joe and Deirdre, around what D&O underwriters are looking at when they're evaluating policyholders on diversity?
I think I touched on a little bit here where we're really trying to understand how the company, via its, again, interaction of the board and with the C-suite and the overall ERM function, is making themselves defensible. Do we have an understanding that if there were to be some type of incident or escalation or headline risk event, and it is largely easy to think because ESG is such a wide term right now, it really, we talked about how the breadth environmental can be. It's not just climate disclosure. It really is a lot of other triggers when you think about, emissions and pollutions and sustainable procurement. But, and then social spans a huge agenda, and governance also. Candidly, some of the largest D&O claim losses come out of governance breaches and lapses, whether that be around conflicts of interests or other. So for us, a critical part of underwriting and part of what we appreciate companies availing is that what's the interaction? And Dan touched on this earlier. How is ERM interacting with internal audit and the audit committee? How is there escalation of incidents and understanding the process for that? Materiality, again, a lot of where we're trying to understand where climate change disclosure is going evolves around a subjective concept of materiality, and trying to understand how a board oversees what gets escalated to them as material, and getting comfort with that, because at the end of the day, we're going to trust that there is a control process in place that is going to make the company defensible. Like, I wish I could say there are some great resources out there, and we are subscribing to a good number of the tools, but they are tools, because there is not a predictor. There's not a rater that is going to say, yes, you are absolutely at a very high risk for being subject to a D&O securities claim. I mean, candidly, there are some companies that have recently IPO'd or become public via a de-SPAC. I won't single out a certain industry, but one of them has been very heavily targeted with lawsuits, and they meet a lot of ESG qualities that would make them a good ESG risk, but they're not necessarily proving themselves to be a good directors and officers insurance risk because of not having the maturity and perhaps the control environment at the time they're going public. So I'll kind of pause there because I know there'll be some other really strong opinions and good opinions here as well.
Yeah, Deirdre, that's really fantastic insight. This is Joe, Sandy. I've spoken with multiple D&O underwriters, and essentially, what we are insuring is effectively the G. Like, that is the D&O policy, is the governance of the organization, right? And to kind of harp on what Dan had alluded to earlier, there's an evolution and some trends, but ultimately these things have existed. And I think that the use of the term ESG, honestly, I was in a group last week where one of the directors raised her hand and said, "Can we just get rid of the ESG term? I'm kind of tired of talking about it. Let's just talk about governing our companies well," right? So I think we're kind of at that place where when we present our executive team to underwriters and we start talking about the G, the governance of the company, and what the company is doing in and around these matters, there is definitely a sniff test with regards to the authenticity of those individuals talking to our underwriters, and being aware that our underwriters know what is being sort of presented as ESG best in class versus implemented as ESG best in class and really good governance. They see a lot of companies and have a pretty good assessment of who is authentic in their efforts and doing the things that they need to do to be a well-governed company. I think in terms of the coverage changes or other resources that are available, they are coming to the table. Dan mentioned something earlier where he said, if you're not aware of these things, to even, it's negligent to even have this discussion. I think it's a super relevant point. And so, our underwriters are investing in risk mitigation and loss control resources in and around ESG matters to educate our clients so that they can become a better D&O risk, being aware of the things that they need to be aware of. Those are things that, as a broker, we're seeing our insurance carriers invest in to make sure that the individuals and the executives that they are insuring are aware of the things that they need to be aware of. In addition to that, I think from a claim side, they're updating their policy forms to give some additional crisis fund coverage, delisting crisis coverage, trigger events for ESG related events, pollution crisis response events. All of these things are arising out of the trends that we're seeing in the market and are to me relevant and specific to what's going on here. And I think positive developments for our policyholders.
Okay.
Sandy, can I make a point which is sort of controversial, which might end up being a question on this? Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely.
So here's my observation about, and since I've got Joe and Deirdre here, they have influence in this world. I might, in answer to your question about underwriting. So I think over time, and hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a sort of Moneyball moment in board composition. So there's lots of opinions about what makes a great board and how it works. And we've gone from, I think, anecdotal and not very thoughtful to actually quite thoughtful, but it's still sort of all out there, right? So some people say, oh, the gold standard is I want a sitting CEO to be on my board because, I want a just retired, audit partner from the Big Four because, right? And there's these thoughts, and they're all great thoughts. But I think someday soon, someone's going to kind of boil it down and say, you know what? The data shows the following things. And here's my slightly controversial point on this, which is, I think one of the most important attributes of already qualified potential directors. So you have directors, let's assume they're wonderfully qualified. The difference between really good directors performing well, really well, fantastically, in my mind, is their ability to dedicate the time. And this is a real, genuine constraint in everyday, board function. And I think the thing that happens right before the crisis becomes fully emergent is oftentimes manageable if directors have the time, if they were really engaged. And so I just want to kind of throw that out there as I know it's not a formal underwriting point, at least I'm not aware of that. I'd be curious if it is. The ability of really talented, highly qualified directors to dedicate the time at the board level, I think is probably going to turn out to be, over the next decade, one of the most predictive, salient attributes for performance of the governance function of boards, because it just increasingly takes so much time. And you can have a great director in every way, and if they don't have the time, I think they'll underperform a pretty good director who has the time. That's my opinion, and it's anecdotal so far, but we'll see if it develops into something more interesting.
This is Joe. Dan, I love your sort of commentary on that. There's, in my 20 plus years of brokering D&O, we've seen multiple sort of trends, but when we run our data and we look, even just probably about, 10, 15 years ago, and we look at the pricing on D&O, it was kind of a joke. I almost wondered, are we even underwriting these deals right now? It's kind of, you just know what you're going to get for a price. And it was pretty uneventful, right? And then 2018 came along and things just went crazy, and maybe even a little bit before that. And so now we're in this place where we're quote unquote underwriting and trying to look at risk and surcharging credit based on different factors, whatever. Deirdre, again, you may have a different opinion on this, but at some point I do feel like the insurance market goes through these fluctuations of looking really, really deeply in underwriting when there's problems. And then they sort of back off, want to gain market share, maybe get a little bit looser on their underwriting standards. And this ebb and flow in the insurance market in general happens in D&O. It happens in many other lines as well. But I think to get to the question of like, how are we underwriting these risks? There is a market function and there's more attention given to it at certain times in the market. The other trend that I'm seeing, which is happening as we speak, is this accumulation of data and how we look at Ds and Os specifically. There are tools, that rank D&Os based on their performance and, give them a grade, A, B, C, D. And so, we're looking at these on the back end, whether the data is valid or not, because I've seen people with a really poor grade, they're actually really great, directors and officers. And so, how they're coming up with the data, how they're parsing that data, I think is evolving, and the quality of and the application of it, I think, is evolving. But what I do think will probably happen, to your point, Dan, is there's going to be a point in time where insurance carriers look at the loss data, they map it against all of these various metrics that right now are sort of in their early phases of being applied to risk. And there's going to be a point in time where there'll be some really strong correlations that can be extrapolated from this data. So I think that process is happening now. We are in a moment in time where it hasn't evolved and gotten mature enough, and we don't have enough time under our belts for this kind of data to be applied in the underwriting process in a meaningful and material way. But Deirdre, you may have thoughts on that. That's just my opinion. I think we're going in that direction, but the concept of being overboarded might come out of that process. Like, what is that sort of flashpoint that we're seeing? These things might come out as time goes on and as the Internet of Things starts to contribute to the underwriting process. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's great provoked thought here. Like, as somebody who's always trying to hone how we approach the insureds that we are underwriting, I think Dan's point really resonates when we think about the fact that 220 targeting books and records demands are at kind of all-time highs. So there seems to be, there'll be a natural correlation with how much time directors are spending on overseeing controls and risk by this, how the proliferation of these 220s evolve and how much of those demands actually turn into suited litigation, or possibly, we identify concurrent regulatory investigation alongside of it. And I think Joe is right. There's going to be the ebbs and flows. So as an underwriter, I'm watching 220s go up. I've got to dig in a little bit more and try and understand this. And maybe the questions I've been asking aren't the right questions. Maybe to Dan's question, we need to understand a little bit more about time dedication. We need to look a little bit closer about who's an active CEO dividing time versus who's a former regulator. Love seeing that. Love seeing a former regulator or, able to devote their time on a board. And we are indeed seeing more of that. So I think both of you raised really good points about how we can continue to hone our question set and our valuable time with our clients to understand their investment in their board.
So are underwriters adding in any new requirements at this time for coverage?
I can answer. The diligence process is still, to the points that all the just raised, like it's evolving and the question set's evolving. And what I'm seeing is partners like Joe really bringing forward and coaching the client on the continuum of representatives to bring into the process. So maybe it's the head of privacy. If it's a very privacy-centric company, it's really bringing, Office of GC into Office of Treasurer and spanning the continuum of resources that we hear from that really truly help. Some of that might be demanded by underwriters, but sometimes I think it's really just the good partner in the broker identifying this and bringing it forward before you have to ask and anticipating what the question's going to be. When I think about coverage and the kind of the implication of where this targeting is going on coverage, I would say, spend time with your trusted broker partner on the type of investigation and inquiry coverage you have in your policy. And I think there is different options that could be available. You could be investing in more, but obviously, that's a heightened backdrop and something you would want to make sure is aligned to your expectation in this heightened environment.
Do you all see, or are you looking at, from an underwriting perspective, the board's preparedness or knowledge of cyber risk for a company? And how is that playing into the G and their ability to avoid some of this potential litigation out there?
I think we all have something to say about this. Dan, you can go.
Dan too.
Well, I'm going to go first. Okay, so at a high level, clearly, cybersecurity issues are the topic that just keeps giving, right? It won't go away. It doesn't deserve to go away because it's an escalating, genuine risk to not just the enterprise, but the reputation, the enterprise, the whole bit. So, couple thoughts. One, I think that the attention to the skill set of directors has always been at issue in the nom-gov function, and we've kind of just spoke to it. And I think that, cyber is now a presumed, attribute that somebody on the board has to have. I would say that my anxiety there, well, one, that's a good trend overall, but I think it can be misimplemented or taken as a solution, which it isn't, and in the following ways. So one, just because you have one really deep expert on the board, that does not a solution make for the board, right? It's great. It's better than not having anyone who's expert, but the whole board needs to speak the vocabulary of InfoSec, cybersecurity, cyber in general, and they need to understand it enough that they can manage the issues that arise around all the complex risk management as well as strategy. So I think the whole board has to be brought up to a level, and most boards I think get that. And if someone is on a board and says, "Oh, I don't pay any attention to cyber, I don't understand that technical stuff," I don't think that's okay. That's kind of like saying, "I don't read balance sheets at all." Maybe you're not on audit, but you need to understand that. So that's the first thing. Second, I actually don't think that you should disqualify a set of candidates who you're looking at a spot for the board and you say, "Oh gosh, we only have one cybersecurity expert. Let's get another one. We really need a cybersecurity expert." Cybersecurity expertise has a half-life, in my experience, of about 3 months. Like if you're at the pinnacle of your career, and you leave that and you're retired, like every quarter that goes by, the cutting edgeness of your knowledge decreases by about half. And so I would say that what you really need is a broad knowledge and the ability to tap the right experts as a board. Remember, boards can rely on third-party experts, and there's now a beautiful suite of options for expertise to be brought to bear at the board level. And I don't think boards should overweight cybersecurity expertise because it really isn't the solution on your board that you may think it is. I would rather everyone be brought up to a certain level and be able to ask good questions and then have at the ready substantial outside expertise that assists the board in making these evaluations. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question, but I've obviously had some pent up opinion about that. There you go.
Joe, Deidre, I care to weigh in on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I almost forgot the question, frankly.
Sorry.
Cyber.
No, I mean, as it relates to cyber, it's obviously relevant. It's a key thing. I do think actually, to tie it back to the sort of diversity point, having a diverse background of business experiences does inform your network and resources and knowledge on cybersecurity risk. Somebody that's been in the tech industry versus the healthcare industry versus the food and agricultural industry versus the energy industry will all have very different opinions and backgrounds on cybersecurity risk. So I think, it does speak to, how you're looking at your candidates coming onto the company. And it is a super relevant item. And I think it's important to think, at least from my perspective in dealing with many companies over the years, that there are definitely very varying degrees and thoughts on addressing cybersecurity risk in terms of how board members might view it.
The only point I'd add, and Dan's point is very well made, like we do, of course, one of the check boxes is there evidenced expertise? Is there a cybersecurity and or privacy expert on the board? What are their credentials? But I think to the points you both just raised, there's layering there. And this is where we really have to look at that interplay with the very rigorous function within the company, within the C-suite, within the office that's built around cybersecurity. And one of the things we really try to understand is like, what's their connectivity to the regulators? Like, who's their first phone call when there's a breach, and understanding, DOJ, SEC connection, obviously that's another function where we like to see a lot of former regulators and that legal experience in there, because again, when you're trying to when we've seen defensibility in D&O litigation that surrounds the cyber event, it's because that control process evidenced itself and the right connections at the appropriate timing and intervals were made to protect kind of the breach escalation. So I don't know if either of you have opinions on that, but I think that's something we look for.
Yeah. The one other thing I'll say on that, Sandy, since this is a sort of insurance audience, there are products in the market, that cyber insurance products that give D&O coverage on the cyber program, which was kind of weird to me when it first came out. But it's actually really interesting because it can also complicate a claims situation when you have D&O underwriters wanting to, address the D&O claim, but then there's this random cyber coverage or D&O coverage trigger that's sitting on your cyber policy. So I think a well-informed broker may want to look at that and understand how your cyber policy is or is not going to respond in a D&O claim, understand how to navigate that in the claims process relative to the D&O underwriters. So there's things that are happening in the non-D&O market, cyber market, tech E&O market that potentially could have some implications in how the D&O claims are adjusted. So that's just kind of a random product trend that we've seen in the market.
I think that's a great point. I think there's definitely overlap that's happening there that's been interesting to watch. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This has been a great, lively conversation around D&O, ESG, and where it's all potentially headed. And I really appreciate you all taking the time with me. Thanks for listening. That was Dan Siciliano, Deirdre Martin, and Joe Talmadge discussing governance and D&O. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can find more Leaders Edge podcasts on SoundCloud, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, as well as leadersedge.com.